Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 26. Capturing the Rhythm, the Indomitable Inculcation of Ingenuity. How attempting to dominate the forces of nature leads to surprising innovation. In the previous two-part episode, forming a trilogy with episode 15, we traced the development of three steppe peoples, each a descendant of the previous one: the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Proto-Indo-Iranians, or early Aryans, and the Scythians. We saw how each epochal generation inherited artefactual and institutional technologies from their predecessor and improved upon them by a process of further innovation and ingenuity. This time, let's explore such a process as carried out by the other of the two offshoots of the Indo-Iranians, the Indo-Aryans.
We start as typical with a fictional story involving some of our now familiar friends.
Brenda is having trouble getting our tail-waggy friend Bruno to eat anything. She's like, "Come on, Bruno, eat." But Bruno turns away. Then she's like, "Please eat, boy." And still no good. "Please, Bruno." No good. "Please." No. She tries all variations of persuasion. Eventually, "Please eat, my dear dog." And then, bam! Bruno dives into his bowl. Brian and Irene, who've been watching this whole thing, are quite amused. Meanwhile, Steve is standing outside looking into the skies with the entreaty. "Please, God, send us some rain. The crops are drying." "Please, mighty Skyfather." That's when Brian and Irene look at each other. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? If a four-y please works for dog, mayhaps it'll also work for God? What's the magic word? Okay, that might be a bit silly, but think about it. Haven't we all responded to how eagerly a request has been made of us? And the more desperate the pleader, the more dramatic could the plea become. And this is not just when directed to a friend or parent, but also to the supernatural. Let's picture ourselves in the ancient past. Most ancient groups we can imagine had elaborate mechanisms of chanting their desires and appeals to the divine forces they thought controlled the environment. In fact, this is not just the case with ancient societies. We still have practices that have persisted, or clues in etymology about how worship evolved. The Spanish word oración generally means prayer. This is the same word as our oration, deriving from the Latin os, or, mouth, which we can also see in words like oral, oracle, and oratory. It's not hard to see the connection here between worship and oral expression. But there is another aspect to this that's much more pertinent to pre-literate societies. They didn't have the comfort of reading from the Book of Prayer. In fact, this is not just about prayer. My core point is relevant to the question of retaining a body of knowledge in a non-literate setup. But we can see how invocations of the supernatural would have special significance, what we'd call sacred. Rhythm of ages. Let's for a moment take a step back and trace the evolution of a device that is still with us today, but was of much greater utility in pre-literate societies. This is what we may broadly call rhythm and verse, the style and structure of how important pieces of information or communication were composed. We have broadly known the distinction between prose and verse, or at least that there is a distinction between them. But in this age of ubiquitous writing, we might think of verse or poetry as nothing more than sentences written in short columns of text. But think about this for a moment. If I write out my normal sentences with just random spacing like this, is that really poetry? The structure present in what is strictly verse, what we loosely call poetry, has a very important practical purpose. At its core, this structure is an aid to memory. It's mnemonic.
In Greek tradition, mnemosyne is one of the muses.
It's a retention mechanism, just as structured scribbles on clay or strokes on paper later came to be. Perhaps the most popular device we know of this structure in modern times is rhyme. We can see how rhyme helps remember. There are other devices as well, repetition, including chorus, alliteration, and many more. In the modern day, however, we only see a small set of the rhetorical and structural devices put to action in our songs.
See footnote for more details.
Still, we can see that the memory aid element is built into the whole idea of songs to this day. We are accustomed to watching our politicians drone on prosaically about their world-changing promises in, well, you can see why I use the word prosaic there. They're almost invariably reading off of sheets of paper or a teleprompter, but no, it's the same thing. But can you imagine your favorite rock star? Let's say, can you imagine Freddie Mercury of Queen at the height of his performance, Wembley Stadium in 1985, going, "We will! We will!"
Heck, what's the next word? Oh yes.
Rock you! So yes, going back to the pre-literate setup, verse, i.e., structured language, mattered. And when it came to existential matters, it mattered a lot. And within the context of its importance, as I hope I've demonstrated above, verse developed into a rather sophisticated science. Most of what we might know of it in the Western tradition has its roots in ancient Greece, which is reflected in much of the technical vocabulary in the domain, which I'll spare you from here, mostly. But nowhere else, perhaps, was this science perfected to such degree and applied with such rigor than by the composers and preservers of an ancient Indo-Aryan body of praise and prayer. Stick with me, and you'll see how they did it and how it's relevant to our own time. The call of Kleos. But let's first go back to the roots of it all, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. We saw in the aforementioned trilogy of these peoples that the PIE folk had this concept of Kleos, which was a very fundamental part of their social makeup. One's place in society relied upon being heard far and wide. As part of this institution, there arose the poet, who played an extremely important role in formulating and disseminating the kleos of his patron, a warrior chief, a clan chieftain, a king. The poet takes up on himself to praise of the deeds of the great man to ensure that his kleos flourish, his fame's heard loud and clear, spreading far and wide. Consider the word fame, Latin fama, which derives from a Proto-Indo-European root baha, to speak, which is the source for a whole bunch of other words, including via Latin, fate, nefarious, via Greek, phone, emphasis, prophet, and the Sanskrit word for language, bahasha, a word used all over South and Southeast Asia, such as the Malay and Indonesian bahasa. And such praise was made and sung not just of the men, but also of the gods, not just of mortal heroes, but of the immortal divine. I have touched upon this in the episode about the ancient Greek revival, in how Homer, perhaps the most venerable poet in European consciousness, preserved the memory of the valiant heroes and their glorious deeds from a dim past which, with no retained writing to bear record, would otherwise not have survived. This is an example of this tradition that can be traced right back to the Proto-Indo-European times. Another excellent example of this PIE inherited institution is the ancient Irish bards. In fact, the very word bard is an Old Irish form derived from a Proto-Indo-European word meaning to praise, to elevate.
It is also from the Irish poetic traditions that rhyme is said to have first originated, at least in the West, in early medieval times.
And we do see vestiges of such traditions in the times and works of the man we, in English, associate with the word bard, William Shakespeare. You could even say, for the Claywos-seeking Proto-Indo-Europeans and their immediate descendant groups, especially ones that didn't have much writing, the poet was a central and important element of the social hierarchy. In his sole office, he took the place of the journalist, TV broadcaster, and other influencers of the modern day. Exacting parameters of praise. So by the time some of the Proto-Indo-Aryans, one of the Indo-Iranian offshoots mentioned, made their way south from Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent roughly around 1800 to 1500 BC, they had a highly developed and vibrant institution of praise poetry, in particular, praising the gods, most notably Indra. Not very much unlike the practice of their steppe forebears, this took the form of large gatherings outdoors where they would sing praises of their gods. It wasn't an idle endeavor. They actually wanted their gods to shower them with material benefits. It was transactional. And much in common with their immediate cousins of the Avestan tradition, those we recognize as Zoroastrians, followers of Zoroaster or Zarathustra, who we also met in episode 09, Kindling Change. The primal catalyst, there was this important dimension of fire, Agni, which was a vital component of their ritual. Agni not only had its literal meaning of fire, but was also the fire god. But something curious happened in the course of those early centuries of the Indo-Aryans making their way more and more into the Indian subcontinent, mainly the greater Punjab region. They developed very strong notions of the correctness of utterance of their words of praise to the gods. From a socioeconomic perspective, this seems to reflect heightened competition for resources, whereby in their belief system, it became imperative that the gods be invoked in the most perfect way possible, so that the gods deigned to attend to their needs, rather than, say, a neighboring clan's. We must also be open to the idea of them interacting with other groups already present in the subcontinent, both earlier waves of Aryans, but other peoples as well. Thus, what had started off as a flexible tradition of impromptu composing and improvising of praise poetry, such as in the Greek Homeric tradition and elsewhere in the Indo-European inherited cultural sphere, started to rigidify. The ancient inherited tradition involved, for example, using formulaic devices to improvise on specific motifs of praise, which are deployed both by Homer and in the early Indo-Aryan tradition. But over time, the impromptu nature gave way to something more fixed. This stems, perhaps originally from an anxiety amongst these Indo-Aryan groups, that the gods might not listen to them if the words of praise were altered in their form. Thus, and though there were other socio-political reasons as well, by the time we get to roughly 1000 BC, we find strenuous efforts and measures put in place to completely freeze the accumulated body of praise poetry. Once and for all. Words fine weft and war. I am here, of course, talking about what by that time got compiled into a single body of work known as the Rig Veda. Compiled as a body of 10 books, this was to go on to become the canon for the Vedic religion that was getting somewhat formalized under the emergence of the first centralized state in the Indo-Gangetic region. It would also be the canonical foundation of the religion that developed much later, about 1,000 years or so later, what we recognize as Hinduism, Brahminical or classical Hinduism. My purpose here is not to talk about the religious developments, but the artefactual and institutional innovations of cultures. So let's focus on their innovative devices applied to ensuring the text was never changed. And let's remind ourselves, and this cannot be emphasized enough, all this was purely oral. Writing did not exist in their culture back then. So that takes us back to the science of verse, that vital device of non-literate information management. A key component of verse is meter. When using meter, a poem is composed with an exact number of syllables in each line and with a precise format of the stanza. For example, pretty much every one of the 150 or so sonnets composed by Shakespeare have exactly 140 syllables in all in 14 lines of 10 alternating syllables each.
The specific meter used being the iambic pentameter and the structure being of 3 quatrains and a couplet.
If a poem does not adhere to this precise metrical structure, it cannot claim to be a Shakespearean sonnet. The Vedic composers similarly had their standard repertoire of meters to deploy, which was part of what ensured the integrity of the oral composition intratextually. But there arose, in the centuries after the freezing, additional extra-textual devices designed to reinforce the textual immutability, make it even more assuredly tamper-proof. For example, there arose an elaborate system of indexes that would note the details, such as the meter, the deity that was being invoked, and a bunch of other low-level information in essence descriptive of and supplementary to the main content. There were also specific ways of supplementary reciting. Remember, this was all oral, the texts. For example, in overlapping word pairs, AB, BC, CD, mirrored word pairs, AB, BA, BC, CA, and other such techniques, alongside the standard full-flowing recitation. Check out the footnote here to see this in action in an example we can relate to. If all this sounds complicated, yes, it is, at least to you and me, but it worked, and we can fully comprehend how and why it worked, because, and here's the kicker. The methods the Aryans devised and applied have the same principles as our modern computer systems, in particular, systems that power all modern digital security, every piece of data sent across the internet, and even digital cryptocurrency. Echoes across epochs. Let me demonstrate this to you without getting into the technical rabbit holes. Modern computing relies on data integrity. Given a chunk of data, it is imperative that we can be sure it has not been tampered with. This also includes systems such as digital keys that ensure user authentication, that, for example, when you log into your email application given your password, the system can verify that it is, in fact, you, and not an imposter. Some of the techniques I hinted at above, in essence, use some of the same principles as checksums and cryptographic hashes that are the somewhat advanced and complex technical basis of ensuring such data integrity and security. The Internet cannot function if one node, computer, or server in the internetwork cannot be sure of the correctness of the data in the packets it's receiving from another node. This is pretty much exactly the same as when you download an attachment from your email. You want to be sure it's genuine and not tampered with. This is implemented in modern internet protocols by a bunch of verification and data redundancy techniques. These are exactly analogous to some of the methods the Vedic preservers developed. Finally, modern digital currencies, such as Bitcoin, rely on the blockchain, which is, as the name says, a series of blocks encoding transactions in the digital currency between counterparties. Such a system can only function if each block, once sealed, can never be tampered with. Would you tolerate someone repudiating a payment already made to you against some item already received by them? And in a decentralized system such as blockchain and thus Bitcoin, etc., it must be possible for anyone to verify the integrity of such sealed information. The Vedic techniques I hinted upon above ensured all that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Rig Veda, a 3,000-year-old oral implementation parallel to modern-day digital security, internet protocol, and the blockchain. I rest my case. The proof of the brilliance of this ancient system rests in the fact that it stood the test of time, far beyond perhaps any of the early innovators ever imagined. I've mentioned this before in my episode on writing, but this might be worth repeating. The Rig Veda, a body of work longer than the Iliad and Odyssey combined, composed entirely orally in the centuries leading up to 1000 BC and formalized at about that point in time into a single compilation sealed to be tamper-resistant, was passed on without corruption of the contents, not a single real modification of the flow of the text, from generation to generation by oral transmission, and without being written down for, wait for it, more than 2,000 years. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that we adopt such measures of oral transmission to handle all the information that's of value to us in our time. In fact, the original circumstances that led to such a feat are so far removed from us in cultural time and space that it's hard for us to even fathom the sheer effort they dedicated to all this, spanning millennia. Our instinctive reaction here might be, heck, why did they even bother? But as we discussed, for example, in the episode on the ancient Greeks and philosophy, or even in the previous treatment of the Steppe groups, people dedicate their efforts in the direction of what matters to them, what they value, and that changes. The question is, within our current value systems, within the realm of priorities, within the sphere of our concerns, how are we dedicating the best of our available resources, and especially our ingenuity, our creativity, our innovation in the best possible way in the pursuit of progress and achievement as we see it?